A night shift nurse uncovers secrets that no one wants to see. She refuses a bribe and everyone makes fun of her. Until the threats grow, an unexpected ally appears and finally, the FBI knocks on the hospital door, changing the fate of the whole city. The night always had a different rhythm in the hospital. The fluorescent lights flickered from time to time, and the silence of the hallways was interrupted only by the sound of monitoring machines or the occasional sigh of a patient who could not fall asleep. For many, working the night shift was a punishment. But for her, for Nurse Clara, it was almost a refuge. There she found a kind of calm that the day did not offer. Fewer visits, less noise, fewer curious looks. But what she did not know was that, in that very silence, secrets were hiding that sooner or later would come to light. Clara had been working at that hospital for 3 years. She knew every hallway, every alarm bell, every gesture of the doctors on duty. She had the habit of walking the floors before sitting down to review files. She did not do it because it was mandatory, but because she liked to observe. A poorly arranged bed, a medicine out of place, a patient with a lost look. Everything said something. She paid attention to those details that others overlooked. The hospital coffee machines seemed to whisper tiredness into every cup. The coffee tasted like burnt water, but it was the fuel of every night. Clara always filled a disposable cup and left it on her desk, next to a pile of forms that never seemed to shrink. Sometimes she thought the papers multiplied on their own, as if the hospital needed to keep everyone busy even when the hallways were empty. However, there was something else in the air, a sense that not everything was what it seemed. Conversations cut short whenever she entered the break room. Nervous smiles among colleagues who quickly changed the subject. Packages arriving at the hospital with no clear sender. Clara did not like to stick her nose where it was not wanted, but she also could not ignore that something strange was moving within the walls of that building. One night, while reviewing the treatment sheet of a newly admitted patient, she noticed something odd. A prescribed medication that did not match the medical history. It was not a serious mistake, but it was unusual. She wrote the observation in her notebook, the one she always kept in her uniform pocket. It was not the first time she had found inconsistencies, although until then she had attributed them to carelessness. However, the frequency with which they happened was starting to bother her. The head doctor on duty, Dr. Mendez, was a man of few words. He always seemed busy, always in a rush. For Clara, his attitude was normal. Doctors carried too many responsibilities. But one early morning, as they crossed paths in the hallway, he said to her in a strange tone, "Just do what's written, and don't ask so many questions." The phrase stayed with her all night. What did it mean? Why did he say it to her, who was only making sure everything was in order? The clock struck 3 in the morning when Clara stopped in the empty emergency room. She took a deep breath. The hospital seemed calm, but beneath that calm, something was moving. She felt it was not just simple mistakes or incomplete forms. There was an invisible current, a flow of things happening in plain sight, but that no one dared to mention. That feeling grew stronger when she heard, in the distance, a muffled laugh in the break room. As she approached, she noticed 2 nurses speaking in low voices, and on the table there was a manila envelope, the kind used to hold documents, although this one seemed far too full to contain only papers. When they saw her enter, both fell silent instantly. "Do you need anything?" she asked, in the most natural voice she could. "Nothing, Clara, nothing," one of them answered, pushing the envelope under some folders. She said nothing more. She went back to her desk, the image echoing in her mind. The night went on. Patients waking up to take medication, anxious phone calls from family members, routine reports. But Clara could not stop thinking about what she had seen. What was in that envelope? And why did the conversation end so abruptly the moment she entered the room? While writing her final notes of the shift in her notebook, She promised herself she would stay more alert. Maybe it was just her imagination. Maybe everything had a simple explanation. But something told her that this night shift was not like the others. That muffled laugh and that hidden envelope were pieces of a much larger puzzle. Dawn arrived with the sound of the first footsteps of the day's staff. Clara handed over her shift as always, with clear reports and a tired smile. No one would have suspected that in her mind questions were burning that would not let her sleep. The days following that night shift seemed the same on the surface. The hospital hallways full of doctors rushing, the metallic echo of stretchers, the constant smell of disinfectant. However, for Clara nothing was the same. That image of the envelope hidden under the folders was stuck in her mind, like a stain impossible to erase. From that moment on, she began to pay attention with different eyes. That was when the small oddities started to appear. They were not scandalous things, nor obvious enough to raise immediate suspicion. But to Clara they seemed far too repetitive to be coincidence. Everything looked like carelessness, until you connected the dots. The first clue came in the form of handwriting. She was reviewing the medical history of a patient who had been admitted for weeks. She knew perfectly well the handwriting of the assigned doctor. Rounded, slightly slanted, easy to recognize. But in the middle of the report, one page showed notes written in a completely different hand. More rigid, cramped, almost as if someone had tried to imitate the doctor, but could not fully hide it. When she asked the doctor about that page, he answered distractedly. It must have been the resident. You know how it is here. Everyone writes everywhere. The answer sounded convincing, but Clara knew the resident was on vacation that week. She said nothing, only wrote in her notebook, "File with different handwriting." The second oddity was even more unsettling. One morning, during the handover, a patient needed to sign the authorization for a procedure. Clara went to look for the document in the folder, but discovered it was already signed. The strange thing was that the signature did not match the patient's. It was not a minor detail. She had seen that man's sign several times, and that new scribble seemed rushed, with no attempt to look authentic. When she mentioned it to the secretary, the woman shrugged. The paper came like that. It must have been a misunderstanding. Misunderstandings. Clara was starting to feel that word was repeated too often in that hospital. The third oddity appeared on a quiet night, when she went to put her bag in the nurse's locker room. While arranging her things, she heard a metallic click coming from another locker. She paid no attention until she saw that the door of that locker was slightly open. She pushed it carefully and found a manila envelope, just like the one she had seen days before. She tried to lift it with one hand, expecting to find only papers. But the weight surprised her. It did not feel like sheets of paper, but something denser. Maybe bundles of bills, maybe something worse. She quickly shut the door and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. From then on, Clara began to notice patterns. Envelopes that moved from one place to another overnight. Duplicate files that mysteriously disappeared. Patients who forgot to give consent but were registered as if they had. Each thing, on its own, could be explained as human error, office carelessness, or bureaucratic misunderstanding. But Clara was certain these were not isolated mistakes. They were pieces of something bigger. What bothered her most was the indifference of the others. When she tried to point out these inconsistencies, she always received the same response. A tired gesture, a joke to change the subject, or an uncomfortable silence that forced her to stop. It was as if everyone knew something she did not, and preferred to pretend nothing was happening. One night, while completing her report, she remembered the words of Dr. Mendez. "Just do what's written and don't ask so many questions." Every day it became clearer to her that this phrase was a warning disguised as advice. The hallways lit by cold lamps no longer seemed so calm. Now, every closed door made her uneasy. Every folder could be hiding a secret, and every manila envelope had become a symbol of something murky. Clara felt she was stepping into dangerous territory without having chosen to. However, there was also something inside her that would not allow her to ignore what she was seeing. She was a nurse because she believed in caring for life, in protecting patients. And allowing these mistakes to be covered up was, in a way, a betrayal of what she had promised the day she first put on her uniform. The hospital kept running, the clocks kept ticking, and the city outside carried on with its rhythm. But for Clara, every oddity she uncovered was another piece of a dark puzzle. She knew that sooner or later she would have to decide, to look the other way like the rest, or to keep watching even if the truth was dangerous. Clara had already learned how to spot the small irregularities. However, what until then had been a string of administrative oversights, forged signatures, and suspicious envelopes turned into something much more direct. They were no longer vague signs or gut feelings. Now it was a clear proposal, placed right in front of her, as if the hospital had decided to test how far her silence would go. It all began on a particularly quiet early morning. The patients were asleep, the monitors played their usual mechanical music, and Clara was finishing writing down the medication doses. That was when a colleague, Sylvia, came up to her with a smile far too wide for the hour. She carried an envelope in her hand, the same kind of manila envelope Clara had seen more than once. "It's your turn this time," she said, placing it gently on the table. Clara looked at her, confused. "What is this?" "A favor. A little reminder so you understand how things work here." The envelope was sealed tight, but its weight gave it away. It wasn't papers. Clara didn't need to open it to guess what was inside. Her first reaction was to push it away with her hand. "I can't accept that." Sylvia let out a short laugh. "Don't be naive. No one's asking you to kill anyone or do anything illegal. Just keep doing what you do every night. Stay quiet sign. Look the other way when things don't add up." Clara felt the words crash down on her like stones. What she had silently suspected for weeks was now right in front of her, with shape, weight, and even smell. They weren't simple office mistakes. It was a system, and she was being invited to become part of it. The envelope sat on the table like a dangerous temptation. Clara couldn't help but think about her own debts. The loan she was still paying off for her younger brother's studies, the late rent that kept her awake, the bills piling up at the end of every month. With the money surely inside that envelope, she could erase all those problems in an instant. She could rest, smile, even allow herself a luxury she had denied for years. "And if I say no?" she asked, though she knew she wouldn't like the answer. Sylvia raised an eyebrow and leaned closer to her. "They'll look at you funny, like someone who doesn't understand the rules. Everyone here does it. It's easier to accept and forget. Believe me, the worst thing you can do is stand out for being honest." The words hung in the air. Clara felt a knot in her stomach. It wasn't just the financial pressure that shook her, but the certainty that if she refused, she would be putting herself in the sights of those moving those envelopes. She tried to hide it, pretending not to care. She stayed silent, stood up from the table, and went back to checking on the patients. But throughout the night, the image of the envelope on the table followed her. It seemed to be in every corner of the hospital, a reminder that now she had to choose. The next day, some colleagues started joking with her. "So, did you like the official welcome?" one of the nurses asked with a laugh. "Don't make a fuss, Clara. It helps all of us," another added. Each comment was an attempt to push her towards silent complicity. Dr. Mendez also approached her in his dry manner. "Look, you don't have to do anything different. Just take the envelope and keep working. No one will bother you if you understand the game." Clara noticed something more than advice in his eyes. There was a veiled threat, a reminder that it wasn't wise to step out of line. But the nurse couldn't do it. That very morning, She left the sealed envelope on the duty desk and walked away. She gave no explanations, no arguments. She knew any word could be used against her. The whispers began to spread through the hallways. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with open mockery. The saint, the incorruptible, they called her, laughing. For them, refusing the envelope was foolish, a gesture that could only bring her trouble. Clara stood firm, but unease began to sink into her skin. Something told her that this decision, so simple in appearance, would have consequences she could not yet imagine. If this story is catching your attention and you want to find out how far Clara will go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave your like. That really helps us keep creating more content like this for you. Let's continue. Clara's refusal quickly became the talk of the hospital. Less than 24 hours had passed since she left the envelope on the duty desk, and rumors were already spreading everywhere. In the hallways, whispered between colleagues, one phrase repeated itself as if mocking her. "Did you hear? She didn't take it." Some said it with genuine surprise, as if they couldn't believe someone would turn down such a benefit that had become so normal. Others repeated it with laughter, using a tone heavy with irony. In no time, Clara earned an unwanted nickname, the one who plays the saint. The atmosphere grew colder. It wasn't just jokes anymore. Now it was gestures. When she asked for help moving a patient, no one seemed to have time. When she requested a file, it mysteriously took longer than usual to arrive. Suddenly, everything became more difficult, as if the entire hospital had decided to punish her for not going along. The head of nursing was the first to change her shifts. Before, she had a steady schedule, balanced enough to rest between days. Now, out of nowhere, she was assigned longer, heavier shifts. Endless early mornings, weekends that once had been respected now crossed off on the calendar. When she went to ask why, he barely looked up from his papers and muttered, "It's nothing personal, Clara." But to her, it was. She didn't need anyone to say it directly. Those punishing shifts were the price for having said no. What hurt most wasn't the extra hours or the mounting exhaustion, but the indifference. Her fellow nurses, those with whom she had shared midnight coffees and late-night talks about life, now avoided her. They no longer looked her in the eye, or if they did, it was with a mix of pity and distance, as if honesty were contagious, and no one wanted to risk being marked like her. The days grew heavy. Every door closing in her face was a reminder that she was alone. Every laugh behind her back was a push to give in and adapt. One night, after finishing her rounds in the emergency area, Clara walked out through the parking lot. The air was cold, and the echo of her steps rang against the empty concrete. But she wasn't alone. In the distance, at the corner, she saw two figures leaning against a dark car. They weren't doing anything, they weren't speaking, they were just watching her. Their faces were partly hidden in the shadows, but the intention was clear. They were there for her. Clara's heart pounded hard. She didn't run, but she didn't let herself look for too long either. She walked to her car, trying to stay calm. She could feel their gaze drilling into her back until she started the engine and drove away. That night, she didn't sleep. The next morning, she discreetly tried to ask who those men usually were around the parking lot. A colleague shrugged. Friends of someone. Don't ask. That "don't ask" became a constant echo. It was the same disguised phrase she had heard before. The same cynical advice everyone seemed to repeat. The message was simple. In that hospital, there were unwritten rules, and breaking them came with consequences. Clara, however, stayed firm. She hadn't chosen this confrontation, but now she was in it. She wasn't going to give in, even if it meant walking alone through hallways filled with hostile stares. The punishing shifts kept piling up, exhaustion became routine, and the mockery never stopped. But deep down, Clara felt that her no had struck deeper than she imagined. She had angered someone who wasn't used to hearing no. And that someone, whoever they were, wasn't going to stay still. Clara had learned to live with the mockery and the isolation, the endless shifts, the hidden laughter, the hallways that seemed to close in on her. She had come to expect all of it. But what came next was different. These were no longer punishments disguised as routine. Now they were clear warnings, thrown at her in the dark with the intent to break her. The first sign appeared in the intermediate care ward. One night, one of the heart monitors began to fail. The alarms didn't sound when they should. The records stopped halfway through a line. Clara checked the cables, the connections, even replaced the machine with another. Nothing explained why. During her shift, the device suddenly stopped working. When she reported the failure, the technician told her the monitor had been tampered with. Like someone wanted it to look like a system error, he murmured uneasily. Clara didn't reply. She felt a chill run through her. The second warning came with a missing order. She had requested basic supplies, gauze, gloves for fluids, the usual, but the delivery never arrived. When she asked at the storeroom, they assured her there was no record of her request. She checked the system, but the order had disappeared as if she had never sent it. Days later, she found a copy of her request crumpled at the bottom of her locker, with one word written across the page in red ink. Careful. From that moment, she knew she was being watched. The hardest blow, however, came on a night of absolute silence. She entered the break room to drop off her things and found a pair of latex gloves on the table. On top of them, written in big black marker, were the words, "You are not welcome." There was no signature, no camera to record it, no witness to confirm what she saw. Just her and that cold message, so direct it made her hands tremble. She felt trapped. She couldn't go to her colleagues. Most of them were part of the machine fed by the envelopes. She couldn't go to her superiors, because they were the ones keeping the machinery running. And the police, what could she say? That an envelope with money and a pair of gloves with a message were enough evidence? With no names, no documents, she had nothing to show. The hospital, with its white lights and endless hallways, began to feel like a kind of prison. Every corner could hide a trap. Every silence could be the prelude to a threat. And even so, Clara refused to give in. That was when she decided to take the first step that would change everything: to document. She bought a new notebook, different from the one she used for work notes. She kept this one in her bag, always close to her. In those pages, she wrote everything down: schedules, names, details of envelopes, suspicious conversations, changes in records, strange looks. Nothing was left out. She even sketched maps of where she found things, as if trying to build a secret map of the hospital. At first, it was an act of desperation, a way to feel less alone in the storm. But soon it became her lifeline. Every entry was a reminder that her truth existed, even if others tried to erase it. The days grew even more tense. She noticed someone went through her things when she wasn't around. Once, she found her bag open, though she was sure she had zipped it shut. Another time, she saw a nurse leaving the break room just as she entered, pretending to be looking for coffee. Clara learned to hide her notebook in unusual places. Inside an empty gauze jar, behind a loose panel in the staff bathroom. Even under her own clothes when fear was too much. The hospital's silence, once a refuge, now pressed down on her. She walked alone through cold-lit corridors, with the constant sense of being watched. The echo of her steps mixed with a growing paranoia, but also with an unbroken determination. "If I don't write it down, they'll erase me," she repeated to herself. "If I don't record it, they'll silence me." She knew. She couldn't trust anyone, least of all the institution that was supposed to protect lives. But as long as she could hold a pencil and fill the pages of her notebook, she felt she was still breathing. And deep in her heart, a dangerous idea began to take shape. If she ever managed to get that information out of the hospital, maybe the world outside would finally hear what everyone inside was so determined to keep quiet. Up until that moment, Clara had resisted alone. Her secret notebook was her only companion in the middle of threats disguised as mistakes. But everything changed the day she met the insurance auditor. Her name was Gabriela Ortega, though everyone simply called her the auditor. In the hospital, her presence triggered immediate rejection. Her arrival meant inspections, uncomfortable questions, numbers that didn't add up, and penalties. She was, in short, everyone's enemy. No one wanted to run into her, and even less to hand her documents. Clara watched her from a distance. A woman with a hard gaze, a flawless gray suit, and a tone of voice that cut off conversations the moment she entered a room. There were rumors that several had tried to bribe her, and she had always responded with a devastating report. For many, she was worse than the police. The first contact between them happened in the hospital cafeteria. Clara was sitting alone, drinking watery coffee to stay awake, when Gabriela sat down 2 tables away. She didn't seem to want company, but Clara, driven by a mix of need and courage, stood up and approached her with an extra cup in hand. "I know the coffee here isn't great, but sometimes it helps," she said, offering it. Gabriela looked at her with suspicion at first, as if calculating whether the gesture hit a trap. Finally, she accepted the cup. "Thanks. People don't usually think of me for these things." That small gesture was the beginning of a conversation that would mark a turning point. Clara didn't dare to tell her everything, but she did drop hints about what was happening. "I've noticed things in the files that don't add up," she said quietly. Gabriela, without changing her expression, replied, "The numbers always tell the truth, even when they try to cover them up. You just have to follow them." From then on, they began to meet in secret. They weren't long or obvious meetings, just a few minutes between shifts or behind a stack of boxes in the storeroom. Clara brought data from her notebook. Patient names, invoice numbers, inconsistencies in donations. Gabriela, in turn, cross-checked that information with what she found in the accounts. What they uncovered together was terrifying. The hospital's donations, which in theory should have gone to equipment and improvements, were being redirected to private accounts. Private ambulances charged for transfers that never happened, medication invoices included inflated amounts, and phantom patients were registered just to justify expenses. The hospital wasn't just a place of corruption. It was a well-oiled machine for laundering money. Clara was amazed at how precisely Gabriela connected the pieces. Each invoice was a crack, each donation a loose thread, and together they pulled those threads until the whole fabric showed its holes. For the first time, Clara didn't feel alone. She had someone who listened without laughing, someone who didn't say, "Don't ask," or look at her with pity. Gabriela, with her relentless character, became the unexpected ally she needed. But it wasn't all relief. The further they went, the more dangerous it became. One early morning, as they left the hospital, both noticed the same dark car that had followed Clara in the parking lot now parked outside the cafe where they met. "It was no coincidence. They already know we're not playing," said Gabriela calmly, though her eyes showed the tension. Clara understood there was no turning back. What they had uncovered was too big to keep in a notebook. The entire hospital was contaminated, and behind its walls hid a criminal network willing to silence anyone. Even so, the alliance gave them strength. For the first time, Clara stopped feeling like a victim and became an active part of an investigation. What had started with a rejected manila envelope was now turning into a fight against a system that seemed untouchable. The tension had been building for days. Clara and Gabriela had managed to gather enough evidence to prove that the hospital was entangled in a corruption scheme much larger than they had imagined. The diverted donations, the inflated invoices, the phantom ambulances. Everything was documented with precision. Clara kept the most important copies in an envelope hidden inside her bag, ready to hand over if anything happened to her. The hallways had become unbearable. It was no longer just laughter behind her back or punishing shifts. Now there was a heavy silence, as if everyone knew something was about to explode. No one dared to speak openly, but the looks said more than words. Clara could feel it. She was marked. The morning of the final blow began like any other. The sound of stretchers, families asking about their patients, the same watery coffee. Clara was finishing changing the bandages of an elderly man when she heard a strange sound. Firm, coordinated footsteps, different from the usual. The metallic echo carried authority through the hallways. When she looked out, she saw them. 4 men and 2 women in suits, badges hanging from their belts, moving with purpose. Their faces left no room for doubt. The murmur spread instantly. The FBI. The agents reached reception and asked to speak with Clara by her full name. At that moment, everyone who had laughed at her fell silent. The jokes that had followed her for weeks vanished like smoke. What remained was the certainty that the nurse they had mockingly called Saint had said no to something far bigger than anyone dared to admit. The head doctor tried to step in, but the agents ignored him. Gabriella appeared behind them, with a folder in her hand and an expression that mixed triumph with exhaustion. They had reached the end of the thread they had risked so much to pull. Clara took a deep breath as the agents escorted her to a separate office. She wasn't under arrest. They wanted her as a witness, as a key piece in the investigation. Everything she had written in her notebooks, everything she had gathered with fear and determination, was now becoming official evidence. In the hallways, the atmosphere shifted completely. Those who had once isolated her now looked down. The laughter turned into uncomfortable silences. The men in the parking lot were no longer a guaranteed shadow, but suspects soon to be questioned. The hospital, that place that had once seemed untouchable in its corruption, trembled under the presence of the federal agents. Clara knew her life would never be the same. She had exposed powerful people, and even though she was now protected by the investigation, the fear did not disappear. Yet she also felt something new: relief. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't walking alone through cold-lit hallways. Gabriella came closer and said quietly, "Your no changed the game." Clara smiled faintly. She hadn't done it for recognition, nor to become a heroine. She had done it because she couldn't accept an envelope that forced her to betray her calling. She never imagined that gesture would unleash something so big. As she left the office, she saw the hospital differently. The hallways that once seemed endless were now filled with fearful eyes, aware that power had shifted. Outside, sirens lit up the entrance while official cars blocked the exit. That day, the entire city heard the news. The FBI was investigating the hospital for fraud and corruption. What had begun with a nurse refusing to accept a bribe had now turned into an earthquake shaking politicians, business people, and criminals alike. Clara didn't know what would come next. Maybe reprisals, maybe an uncertain future. But what she did know was that she had made a difference. Her no had not only protected her, but had opened the door for others to understand that silent complicity is also a crime. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell, and give a like so you won't miss more stories like this one. See you next time!